Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Tuesday's Telephone Town Hall. And I have to say, it's a lot better and more comfortable to be with all of you than it was to be on Fox TV yesterday, because this is who knows what's really going on in our communities. So I am so grateful to be with everyone today and to actually, all kidding aside, to really talk about what's going on for the AAPI community. We have seen hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders go up dramatically this year. And we want to really take it on today and talk about what all of us can do. We have a community of activists and community of allies who want to make sure that we are all safe and secure. And that starts with what we can do to help, whether we're AAPI or not ourselves, how we can help our colleagues, our friends, our sisters, our brothers, and those who are not binary in the AAPI community. So we're doing this today when it's also AAPI Heritage Month, which obviously this year takes on more important meaning because of the hate crimes that we have confronted. Our union has worked in solidarity with the AAPI communities. We recently published this page of resources. I think we will show it here for AFT leaders, members in our community. And it's at aft.org/stopasianhate. And if you check me and my guest Twitters tonight, we'll be sharing a number of resources from our allies. But what I want to do is tell you all who's joining us. One person, now I'm going to introduce all of you. The person who just got onto the Zoom, someone who probably is juggling 18 Zooms at the same time, I think this is SteamYard, but you know what I'm talking about, is Congresswoman Grace Ming from New York's 6th District. Congresswoman Ming and I actually happen to go to the same law school, and we've known each other for, I won't tell you how long, but she is an amazing congresswoman from New York who has also stepped in and been a leader in the fight against hate right now. And then we have Kent Wong, the director of the UCLA Labor Center and a vice president of the California Federation of Teachers, and someone who has really spent a long time studying labor and advocating for what we need to do to raise our labor movement and grow it. And then you have Artie Coley, the executive director of Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, of the Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. And Artie, I just met today after following her very distinguished career. I'm so glad that she's here today. And then you also have the indefatigable Jessica Tang, who is the chair of AFT's AAPI Task Force and the president of the Boston Teachers Union. And so, I could talk a long time about what, we need to do and what as a union we need to do as we fight misogyny, as we fight hate, as we fight racism, and as we educate children, as we care for patients, as we help our communities. I can go on for a long time talking about who we are and what we need to do together. But I think what I'd rather do right now, instead of talking about that, instead of talking about Donald Trump and the kind of misinformation chaos that he has seeded in so many awful ways, what I want to do instead is talk about how we have to recognize that the violence against Asian American communities is in large part of a larger system of violence and racism against all communities that are communities that other people think are the other. Communities of color, Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, Islamic, immigrant communities. The AAPI community is one of the fastest growing racial groups in the country. It's grown 4 times faster than the total US population, and it's expected to double by 2060. It's a mosaic of rich cultural and ethnic diversity, which represents over 100 languages and 50 ethnic groups. The history of Asian Americans in the United States is an integral part of American history, not always a nice part of American history if we remember what happened during FDR's administration. And we have a responsibility as educators, school support staff, healthcare professionals, public employees, and members of the broader community to learn about our country's shared history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We know that when it comes to education, AAPI teachers only represent about 2% of the workforce. We know that a 98% gap has huge consequences on instruction, on curriculum, on school climate. It means that people are often invisible. And not just for our AAPI students who don't get to see themselves reflected in their teachers, but for all our students. So part and parcel of what we're trying to do today is that this is part of our being, or trying to be, an entity, an organization that combats racism, that lifts up anti-racist behavior, that recognizes our diversity in our country and our multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-generational society. And so that's what we want to do today. And we wanted to do that with not me, but with people who are deeply steeped in the work that we all do for justice and for opportunity, for education, for economic dignity, for voting rights, and all the other rights that we have fought for the freedom to thrive. So first, let me introduce, I'm going to start with Kent Wong, and then Congressman Grace Ming, and then I'm going to go to Jessica Tang, and then I'm going to go to Artie Coley. And I know that Congresswoman Ming has to leave after she speaks. But let me start with the professor, with Kent Wong, the director of the UCLA Labor Center, and as I said before, the vice president of CFT. Kent teaches courses in labor studies and Asian American studies, and was the founding president of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance and of the United Association for Labor Education. So, Kent, I'm going to ask you the following. What do you say to people who are trying to understand why there is this hateful surge? How do we explain it to people? Is it the lack of education and history? That is it the invisibility of the AAPI community in many people's lives? Is it Donald Trump? Is it the same kind of what forces do you think are at play here?
Well, thank you so much, Randy, for hosting this town hall in honor of AAPI Heritage Month, and also for the work that you do as a leader, not only in the American Federation of Teachers for Public Education, but for the broader fight for economic and racial justice. So the question that you posed is something that is being discussed all across the country. How could this be that the 22 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been facing this unprecedented wave of attacks and violence and threats to members of our community? And it is deeply hurtful. It is deeply disturbing to see elders, people within our community who are being the target of this attack. And the reality, as someone who teaches ethnic studies and labor studies, is that we have to confront the long history of anti-Asian prejudice and violence dating back well over a century. All the way back in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first racist immigration law in US history that barred an entire group based on their nationality. And anti-Asian immigration policies lasted for more than 60 years in this country and were only overturned during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So the Asian American community owes a debt of gratitude to the Black freedom struggle in this country. And we have to understand the integral link between the interests of the Asian American community and the interests of other communities of color. So we cannot combat anti-Asian violence without standing with Black Lives Matter. We cannot combat anti-Asian violence without addressing the separation and caging of children at the border, without addressing the ban on Muslims, without addressing the attacks on voting rights to eliminate democracy in critical states across this country and to undermine the participation of voters of color. So we as educators have a special role to play. I've been teaching a class on nonviolence with Reverend James Lawson for more than 20 years. You cannot combat violence with violence. You cannot combat hate with hate. And it is an opportunity for us to lift up the voices of Asian Americans throughout this country, to share their stories, to share their history, to share their legacy, and to stand side by side with other communities of color and others who are being wrongfully targeted and fight for a better day, for justice and for inclusion and for democracy. So that's what I think the American Federation of Teachers is all about. That's what we as educators must be doing to educate our children for a better future.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ken. And I knew you would, we know you. I know you for, probably decades now. And I knew you would, just help center us and root us in, what this discrimination has been a long and terrible road. And we do have an opportunity as a community, a broader community, to actually, find ways of challenging it and changing it. And that's what we need to do as justice fighters. And, one of the people who are doing it every single day is someone who, works as a congresswoman, and that is Grace Ming from New York's 6th District. I think it's your 5th term, if I am getting that right, representing Queens, including West, Central, and Northeast Queens. And I think I know you're the first and only Asian American member of Congress from New York State. And I think you're the first female Congress member from Queens since former Vice President nominee Jerry Ferraro. And I also think, if my notes are right, you got a couple of really heavy-duty committees that you work on: the Appropriations Committee, State and Foreign Operations, and focusing on a whole bunch of things in terms of veterans, military, consumers, children, and communities. But what I want to say to everyone on a personal basis is you're going to see Grace fighting to keep the post office open and fighting to make sure military families have what they need, and fighting for kids in Queens and all through the United States. And that's all before she's had breakfast. So with that, I just want to say and ask you, Grace, sorry, I should say Congresswoman, but the Senate passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act last month. And a lot of us who are cynical, were pretty surprised that something that was of such importance, we knew that Chuck Schumer would try to do that, but it was passed with what I recall to be pretty much bipartisan support. So how did you get, I know Maisie got that done too, but how did you get that done?
So, first of all, thank you to Randy and the whole AFT family for convening us today. I can't tell you how special it is as an Asian American for us to have this space, to have this real conversation. And on a personal note, too, I want to thank Randy for her years of friendship, mentorship, and guidance. I know for sure we can talk about it another day, everyone, but I wouldn't be in Congress without Randy. And my kids wouldn't be who they are without teachers every single day whenever I'm in Washington, when I'm working, and definitely through this COVID pandemic, I've seen the sacrifices that our teachers make in person and online every single day. And I could never express enough gratitude for all of you. And thank you for bringing up this legislation. This legislation, honestly, we actually wrote it last year. Many people didn't necessarily care enough to really talk about the legislation. And then within the last few months, I think because we started to see all these incidents happening to our elderly, and then we saw the murders happen in Atlanta, Georgia, the whole world kind of woke up. And so we were putting forth this legislation that really just, collects data, gives better guidance for local law enforcement to take a look at these cases, to see how to better and more effectively investigate these cases, and to make it more easily reportable for victims of these incidents who might not know how and where to report them, who need multiple languages and resources to be able to report them. And to be honest, even the morning of the passage of this bill in the Senate, we were hoping for 60 votes, 60 Republican and Democratic votes. I never thought that it would pass 94-1. I have to give a lot of credit, of course, to Senator Hirono, who sponsored the bill, but also to my senator in New York, who happens to be the majority leader, Chuck Schumer, who fought tirelessly for this legislation.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I know that you have to leave shortly, but I would just ask what I want to ask you just one kind of personal question, because you were, January 6th. How are you doing with your colleagues these days in the aftermath of January 6th and the aftermath of all of this kind of hate that we see in so many ways? Like how are you doing? And how is it being with your colleagues?
I don't feel like we will really feel the real impact because we are sort of separated due to COVID, right? Like we're not all on the floor at the same time. We're not physically together in hearing rooms. Much of this has been done virtually, but I know that there are many colleagues on the Democratic side that are reassessing, if they are able to work with some of these members who literally can't say that President Joe Biden is the real president. And so it's really hard. And as someone who was, I was with Representative Lois Franco in a room stuck for hours on January 6th. And when I went in that morning, I barely saw any presence of any, enough law enforcement or barricades, and thought it was really strange. And now, as the investigation is still going forth, we want to know what happened and why we didn't have the support that we would for almost even any other large gathering on Capitol Hill. So a lot more details need to be revealed.
Well, let me just say, we love you, we care about you, and we are just so grateful that you're in Congress. And so thank you. Thank you from all of us. The same kind of gratitude that you gave and showered on all of us, we want to shower on you, and we want you to know we have your back. The AFT has your back.
Thank you so much. Same here and always. Be safe, everyone.
You too. So with that, I want to introduce Jessica Tang. Our members know Jessica a lot. She is now the chair of AFT's AAPI task force, but as president of the Boston Teachers Union, she has been engaged in the practice of bargaining for the common good and of engaging community and bringing community together and fighting the justice fights in so many different ways. And so I want to ask you, Jess, I mean, you're the first person of color, first openly queer and woman in over 30 years to serve as the president of the Boston Teachers Union. And for a lot of people who don't know Boston, or who know Boston to visit but don't know Boston, that's a pretty big number of firsts for Boston. And so as a teacher activist, you've been involved in a whole bunch of different community work. You've been advancing a whole lot of racial, social, and economic justice issues. And so, and you've been doing things to make visible what's invisible in so many different ways. And now you're doing it about AAPI issues, and particularly in a moment of such great crisis. So what's it like? What do you need us to do? What is the call to action to us on, issues around instruction, curriculum, school climate? What can we do to deal with, particularly given the invisibility, all this xenophobia and all this racism, not only in schools, but our communities?
Sorry, I had to unmute. So first of all, I just wanted to thank you because when I brought this idea with others from Paula and AFT members to create an Asian American Pacific Islander task force, you were immediately supportive, and that came out of the last convention. And how timely was it that we were able to get it up and running and have our first meetings before the most recent spate of violent attacks towards Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And so I do think that put us in a position where we're able to respond. And in schools, that response, I think, has been really challenging because that infrastructure or that community wasn't in place yet in a lot of our schools and a lot of our districts. And so there is, I think, an inclination sometimes to do two things, which I am asking people not to do, actually, in districts not to do. One is to immediately lean on Asian American Pacific Islander educators to provide all of the professional development or the workshops or the courses on racial equity training. It's really unfair in a couple ways. One, just because you're a woman, for example, doesn't mean that you can give trainings on women's studies, and just because you're of a certain race doesn't mean that you're equipped to actually provide the professional development. And at the same time, the most recent attacks continue to be a source of a lot of trauma and pain and hurt. And so to ask educators, especially during pandemics, to then on top of that provide the professional development for the school or the district, it's not right. And there are organizations out there that do this work already. And so I think another inclination sometimes is to lean on policing or punitive policies in response to hate crimes. But instead, I think actually the most important responses are about policies that create more inclusivity. And of course, as educators, education and learning about the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in our country. As Kent shared, the history is very, very long. Asian Americans have been in the country, in the United States, for centuries. And the violence is not new. It's happened systemically in ways, for example, deportations to the exclusion laws, et cetera. And that history is just completely missing. And so one is definitely, taking the time to learn the history of Asian American Pacific Islanders and how we've experienced racism in this country. And Other supports include affinity groups for students and educators of color, advocating for policies that support more educators of color. As Randy shared, 2% in the nation, but we're certainly not just 2% of the population, especially in certain communities. It's much, much higher, yet there are not representative educators of color from Asian American Pacific Islander backgrounds in those communities. Interpretation and linguistic access for our families and our students is incredibly important. Oftentimes, a lot of the Asian languages, of which there are many, are completely left out or neglected. And one of the most important, I think, advocacy points is around ethnic studies in terms of solutions. How do we have intersectional understandings and learnings about the roots of racism, and learning that history of not just Asian Americans, but African Americans, also Latinx, indigenous communities? That's all a part of ethnic studies. And to be able to center our curriculum around taking the time to learn everyone's history and our intersectionality is a part of combating racism, and should be a part of the curriculum. And so that's something we've certainly been fighting for at the Boston Teachers Union, and have a BTU Ethnic Studies Now committee, which successfully advocated for the first ethnic studies coordinator for the district. And so I'm happy to share some of more of those resources. So on our btu.org website, we actually have a link, professional development, and under there you'll see ethnic studies, and there are resources that can be shared there. And then second, I know that the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, which I proudly am the AFT appointee for, has just recently come up with the APALA toolkit to fight anti-Asian hate. And so those are two concrete resources that you can follow up with. But it does, I think, call on us to all do our part. And those are some of the inclusive practices that we can advocate for as local unions, educators, and just members of a community that believes in a community where everyone is actually welcome and included.
Thank you so much. And what we're going to do tonight as well is I'll make sure that in my tweets tonight, we will share some of these resources. And, you know, I want to get to Artie next, but you know, there's a whole bunch of questions here, including a question of mine that I really want to ask you, Artie, and Ken, about why do we think that this has become so much of the cultural war? Like the moment that you say something like ethnic studies, you know, if this was, it would be just completely vilified by the right-wing media organizations, and you know, and it was just, it's, you know, it's this sense of the vileness that comes out of just trying to understand history and understand all reflections of history. And so, Artie, you've been doing this caucus. The caucus is the first organization in the country to represent and promote the legal and civil rights of Asian and Pacific Islander communities. And you know, you probably have feel like you have all the responsibility of the world on your shoulders.
Yeah.
But you lead this, and you know, this is your reputation. It's an honor for me to be with you in community this first time. But you lead with a vision of increasing power and agency of low-income immigrant communities to advance the economic and racial justice in our democracy. So, so I'm going to start with that question. But you probably are taking on, you know, tons of lawsuits in terms of addressing and dealing with, you know, the rise of anti-Asian racism and hate. So, you know, tell us what you think and what to do.
Sure, I have all the answers.
Right. We need them.
Yeah. Well, let me just say, you know, on the ethnic studies question, it is absolutely exactly what you said, which is that people don't want our histories told, right? Because we want to have this, we want to hide the fact that we had Japanese American incarceration, and that that people lied to the Supreme Court to let that happen. And that, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. We have we have this history of targeting people based on their race. And for some reason, people don't feel like they want to admit that, because if we admit that, then we have to address it. And so I think that's the resistance that we find. And actually, our organization is 49 years old, and it was founded mainly by the children of folks who were incarcerated during Japanese American internment. And so our legacy is one of fighting for racial justice. And I can tell you, as a South Asian American, I remember what happened post 9/11. So many members of our communities were targeted, based on anybody who was perceived to be Muslim. And so last year, when the attacks started happening, I knew what was coming, because we have a long history of this. So we gathered together a table, an Asian American leaders table, and Paula is a great part of that table, where we are working together to address this racism. And I also want to actually explain a little bit about what's happening, because I think a lot of folks are seeing, obviously, the terrible violent attacks on their social media. But in addition to that, actually, the vast majority of racism that's happening, like about 90% or so, doesn't rise to the level of crime. So it's stuff like, racial epithets, being, refused service in a business. You can't get in my Uber, stuff like that, being told to go back to your country. And so we can't necessarily legislate an answer to that level of racism. And one of the things that we've been doing at the local level is doing bystander intervention trainings. Because even, pre-COVID, we had reports like a woman's in a coffee shop and someone's screaming racial epithets and go back to your country. There are people around and no one does anything. So you have the trauma of being, harassed, and then you have you're re-traumatized because no one is stepping up for you. And so one of the bystander intervention trainings are a great opportunity for people to learn, because I think many of us freeze. We don't know actually how to respond, and to learn ways to safely respond based on your own particular situation. And that's one thing that individuals can do, is get trained on how to intervene and speak up. And then at the federal and state level, I think it's a lot of, the previous folks have talked about some of these policy interventions that we really need to see. One of the things that's really sad to me is, of the violent offenses, for example, the Filipino woman in New York City who was kicked, the 2 elderly Asian women in San Francisco on Market Street who were stabbed, the perpetrators have a history of mental health issues. And so we're in a country where we got rid of our mental health system because we felt it was abusive. We replaced it with nothing. Your options are prison or the street. So this is a failure, yes, we can prosecute this individual perpetrator, but really it's a failure of our system. If we don't have adequate mental health supports or provisions for people who are struggling, then clearly we will be dealing with this violence moving forward. So, that's some of the things that we're struggling with as a community. Is we absolutely work in multiracial coalitions. We are, have been fighting against mass incarceration for a long time, and we don't want to be increasing the criminal legal system, which we feel like hasn't served anybody well. And so what is the solution? How do we get safety? If we're not looking to the existing system, which, by the way, I've talked to a lot of seniors, They don't want to call the police. They don't trust the police. They don't speak their language. They're not comfortable, right? But they want to be able to walk safely to the grocery store. So we have been looking at other interventions like community ambassador programs, and other community-based solutions which need to be invested in. And that investment both has to come from the federal level and the local level. I will say schools play a part in this too, in the sense that when, just pre-COVID, one of the most sort of, public issues that of anti-Asian hate happened in a school playground in Los Angeles. And the question was, how do we handle this? And I think schools have an opportunity to really explore restorative practices, whether that's restorative circles, other peer mentoring, practices that reduce the school to prison pipeline and really look at, once you put, whether it's a juvenile or somebody else in prison, a lot of our prisons are racially segregated. So that's not going to actually address the root cause of racial violence. And we've got to really have these difficult conversations, give the perpetrator an opportunity to repair the harm. And those are hard. That takes time, investment. And I know teachers are strained as it is. So, I feel like those resources should be coming to schools to really address these issues in a systemic manner. And, as lawyers, we're not going to solve the problem of racial inequity and racism in this country. Yes, we can ask for accountability and we can file lawsuits, but really the solution has to come from culture change. And teachers are such an essential part of that culture change. When I think back to my own history, teachers who inspired me, my, high school feminist teacher who taught me, history that I then went on to pursue learning more, or the times when I was failed, when I was bullied in 8th grade and literally no one for an entire year helped me in that school. And yeah, so I've been there, and I will tell you, one of the things for the Asian American community, and I've talked to a lot of people, the amount of bullying of Asian American kids in schools is rampant. Rampant. I have yet to meet someone of my generation who didn't deal with it. And so, and I know we're not alone. I know it's happened to many other communities as well. But I think the fact that people are talking about it is relatively new. And teachers can play such an important role in making sure that we are seen, right? We're talking about the invisibility of our communities, and that we learn how together with other communities of color to really build together this vision of America that we want to see. Thank you.
Well, you just gave us a lot to think about. And as you were talking, Artie, I was thinking about all the kind of bullying that kids get for being different, and how much, we don't see or don't want to see. And, how, I watched as, and I thought about just my own history of being gay and how closeted I was when I was young, because, the first few instances where I told anybody anything, I got spat on. And, and how do we, as teachers, really try to not just make things visible, but how do we create a safe, welcoming environment for all? And frankly, I think that, and I have a lot more to say about this on Thursday. I'm in the midst of about to give a speech on all of this, about how we reopen, recover, and reimagine. And part of this is there's a lot of funds from the American Rescue Plan that the Congress passed, that Joe Biden pushed for. I mean, many of us pushed for it as the HEROES Act beforehand. But there's a lot of resources there that can help deal with not just social emotional recovery, but the kind of how we make sure that we respect our differences and actually laud and promote our differences and not just be grateful about them, but celebrate them. And as a bigger community, as Jessica said before, as a way of really doing the kind of intersectionality that helps create what so many of us in our education world now call cultural competence, and how we have this kind of cultural competence, just like we would have pedagogical competence in our content area. And we have to make this part and parcel of what we do. So I'm going to see if, Adam, you can put all of us on the screen right now, because I want to, there's a couple of questions that have been submitted. And I know we have a few more minutes, so I'm going to just ask two of the questions that have been submitted. One is a personal one that I'm going to end with, but on this one, on civic engagement, because I have a theory here that part of what's going on here is that we're seeing a lot more civic engagement of the AAPI community. And if you think about it, there was a pretty big increase from, just under about 2.8 million people who identify as AAPI voted in the 2016 election, and that went up to about 4 million in the 20 election. And according to the AAPI Victory Fund, turnout in Arizona, AAPI turnout soared to 80%. In Arizona, turnout in Michigan jumped 58% and rose 32% in Wisconsin, all contributing to the election of President Biden. But also, there was pretty big turnout in Georgia. Yeah. And so the question I have is, part of it is, do you see, that there was, that this, first off, this is awesome. And, and because of it, is there something kind of like, what should the president address here? That's the easy question. That's the easier question. But the harder question is, in this culture, crazy, terrible, racist, sometimes culture that we have, do you think that this easy access to guns, and was a part of what we're seeing right now, and a part of this kind of violence because of taking power and of exerting agency?
Well, I can start.
Anybody. I know it's a hard question, but I want
right.
questions.
Yeah. Well, I will just say that turnout was based on a lot of work by a lot of different folks who targeted. I mean, we're nonpartisan, but we ran a GOT to get out the vote operation in certain regions where we knew there were growing API populations, including Georgia. And we had Asian Americans reaching out to other Asian Americans, encouraging them to vote. And having my first job, I started my career in DC. I worked for Unite, the Garment Workers Union, ran, during election cycles, like phone trees and all of that stuff. And then also when I worked on the Hill, I felt like our communities were never even targeted. Like nobody even paid any attention. Right. Like we were too small, or we were, inconsequential. And now people are sort of sitting up and being like, oh yeah, actually, these communities matter. And we've known that forever. And we know that if you don't talk to voters, they're not going to come out and vote, right? And one of our challenges is our communities speak so many different languages. And it's not one community, it's not one language. And that's the hard work. But, by 2050, we'll be 10% of the population in a majority minority country. So we are ignored, to everyone's detriment, because we are being courted by forces opposed to social progress. Our communities are being courted to oppose, rights for workers, to oppose, criminal justice reforms. And we need voices on the other side communicating to our communities. And so that's the hard work that we do every day. When it comes to guns, absolutely, I think we have a real issue in this country. Personally, it's not an issue that, our organization does advocacy on. But I will say that, like if you look at Europe, they don't allow guns. They don't, the way that we do. And they don't have this level of violence and harm that's occurring here. Mm-hmm. And so, is there a political will? I think we're going to have to work really hard to build that. We're not there yet.
I definitely agree with Artie's points that there are 22 million Asian Americans. We are the fastest growing ethnic community in the country. And I see a political awakening occurring within the Asian American community, where Asian Americans are more engaged in the political arena than ever before, because the Asian American community has come to recognize and understand that they have a vested interest in who runs the country, especially after the horrendous racist administration that we suffered under for 4 years. And so as the Asian American community is growing in its political maturity and engagement, we are also encountering fierce anti-immigrant hostility. More than 70% of Asians in America are immigrants. And so the anti-immigrant hysteria and the white supremacy that has been targeting immigrants has also been directed at the growing API community. So I do see that this awakening will bring about a better society. It'll bring about broader coalitions that will unite communities of color and people of conscience, that will stand together to fight for a multiracial democracy that has truly never fully been embraced in this country. And that will bring about a better day in this country.
And I'll just add 2 quick pieces. I think in addition, if we're talking about, the violence, the gun violence in Georgia, I think we also have to talk about misogyny and the objectification of Asian women, the dispensability of certain groups and the otherness of groups, including the perpetual foreigner status that many Asian American Pacific Islanders continue to confront. And so I think these intersections of racism, violence, misogyny that have produced, unfortunately, what the latest acts of violence that have brought so much attention. But again, this is not new, and it's existed for a very long time. And if we don't name all the different ways that these forms of discrimination and hate intersect, then we're not fully solving the problem.
So so first off, thank you for all that. And thank you for, helping to answer the hard questions, because this is the violence, the misogyny, as Jessica said, the objectification of Asian women. I mean, it's not new, and there's been a lot, and so in some ways, it's making visible not just the advocacy, but making visible and for us to confront some of these hard truths and what to do about it, and how those of us who are not AAPI, how we can be in community and how we can be allies in a real deep way. I am very struck by what Jessica said earlier about don't just have the very few Asian American Pacific Islander teachers or other educators that are working in a district then all of a sudden be responsible for all the professional development. That doesn't, and don't all, it's kind of like there's a lot of research about we need to have more Black men in teaching, but don't actually make them do all the work that the rest of society have to do. It's important to have the kind of diversity and so I think that's really important for us as a very concrete, tangible takeaway. But I want to end on a very personal note. And, we often, I often used to think about all these heritage months as Hallmark holidays, as opposed to anything really meaningful. But this year, they've been really meaningful in so many different ways. And we have used them as ways of celebrating and reflecting. And this is one of the times we've done that. So I want to just ask all three of you, what does AAPI Heritage Month mean to you on a very personal note, if you are willing to answer? So let me start with Ken.
I think that Asian Pacific Heritage Month is a time for our community to stand up, to stand together, and to see the incredible beauty and diversity that exists within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. I also think it's a time for us to get organized, that organizing changes lives. We saw that with the teacher strikes across the country. We saw that with the extraordinary work of Stacey Abrams and a Black community-led effort to get out the vote in Georgia and throughout the country. We see that in the courageous immigrant youth who are fighting every day for immigration reform. Organizing helps to improve democracy. Organizing helps to build power for working people and to make a society that is more just and more democratic. So that is the spirit that I carry with me during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month.
Thank you, Kent. I'm going to go to Artie, and then I'm going to end with Jessica.
I'm thinking of my great-grandfather who moved here from India in 1915 and lived in Kansas City for most of his life, where he wasn't even allowed to become a U.S. citizen because of our laws. And how, my job is to carry on his legacy of fighting for his rights. I feel really humbled and grateful for what I get to do with this amazing community of folks. And I want to just share a website that we've created called AAPIsrising.org. AAPIsrising.org. It's a list of events and resources to celebrate API Heritage Month. And we'll be coming out next week with solidarity stories, which can be used by teachers. So hopefully you'll get a chance to look at that because there is such a vibrant community of AAPIs right now who are building and creating. And I'm so privileged to share that with you. Thank you.
So for me, when you asked the question, I actually became a little emotional because we have been invisible for so long in many ways. And so it's really about visibility, that, we do matter, our community matters, what we face matters. And I'm just so struck sometimes, during the last few months, because of the greater visibility, where, I've shared stories and people are shocked by, oh, wow, I didn't realize how much racism Asian Americans face. Or surprised that I'm like, yeah, in high school, I got called a chink before, I was standing in a progressive part of Boston and told to go, someone yelled by, in a car passing by to go back to China. And how many experiences so many of us just don't talk about, and no one really asks about. And so to me, it's about visibility, but it's also about empowerment of our community. and helping us all recognize our own power to be able to take action, to make change, to organize, as Kent said, and to really, not just stand up for the Asian American Pacific Islander community, but all communities of color. And this is a call to all of us that hate in any form, we've got to be opposed to, and we have a voice, and we can fight it. We can fight and stand with our Black Lives Matter community. We've got to stand up for our immigrant community, of which AAPI members are very much a part of. We've got to fight deportations. We've got to stand with our indigenous communities, and we have the power to be a part of that movement and to really get to the root of racism in this country and to unroot it. And so it's powerful in that it's an opportunity to have that visibility, but also that voice, and be part of something bigger, a bigger movement that is the only way we can actually combat racism, truly. And so, I am grateful, and also knowing that it cannot just be 1 month of the year, and that ethnic studies needs to be a part of American history and American studies, and so much more.
All right. So look, I can't thank you enough. I hope that everyone who is watching has, felt that same, you have opened up a lived experience for so many of the people who are watching this FaceTime live. And let me just speak for them to say, we so appreciate, and we appreciate that we together as union activists, that we can create or help create empowerment, organizing, visibility, the fight for justice, which takes so many different forms. But we also really appreciate you coming on and talking about lived experience during this Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and also in dealing with all of the hate that people have experienced and Asian American Pacific Islanders have experienced in the last several months. So I'm just really, really honored to be with all of you. And obviously, as Jessica just said, and everybody shook their head, the conversation doesn't end at the end of May. And we need to actually make sure that we embed these kind of ethnic studies in our curriculum, regardless of what the right wing may say or not say about it. And we need to make sure that people have resources. So we're going to make sure that the advancing justice resources are put on our Share My Lesson website. We're going to make sure that the Boston Teachers Union resources are put on there. And we have often put resources from Kent Wong on there as well. And so I encourage people to visit Share My Lesson, where we'll put a lot of these on. And I just want to say to Artie, to Kent, to Jessica, and to everyone else who's watching, thank you so much, and good night, everybody.
Thank you, Randy.
Thank you.